The U.S. says it has carried out a deadly new strike on a boat allegedly carrying drugs in the Caribbean, killing 3 people on board. Since the beginning of September, the U.S. has carried out 17 attacks on boats in the Caribbean and the Pacific, saying it is targeting drug traffickers. Critics, including the UN's human rights chief, have described them as extrajudicial killings in violation of international law. And one of the groups the U.S. says it is targeting in the strikes is the ELN, a Colombian guerrilla group that Washington and the EU designate as terrorist organizations. The ELN controls part of Colombia's border with Venezuela and is involved in cocaine trafficking. In January, Colombian President Gustavo Petro declared war on the ELN in response to violent clashes between rebel groups in the Catatumbo border region. Peace talks between the government and the guerrilla have repeatedly failed. For more on the ELN and its role in Colombia's violent drug trade, I'm joined now by Jeremy McDermott. He's the co-director of Inside Crime, a media organization and think tank dedicated to the study of organized crime in the Americas. Good to have you on the show, Jeremy. Tell us, what part does the ELN play in drug trafficking in Colombia?
The ELN have a bit of a love-hate relationship with the drug trade. They hate the damage it does to their revolutionary credentials, but they love the money that it brings in. Their main role is in controlling coca crops, the raw material for cocaine, providing protection for drug laboratories and airstrips, and they control many of the crossing points from Colombia into Venezuela, which is a big transit nation as the drugs move to other parts of the world.
You mentioned the love-hate relationship. Just to give our viewers some context, the ELN is one of Colombia's oldest rebel groups. It emerged in the 1960s, actually as a radical leftist group battling the Colombian state, but there doesn't seem to be all that much left of its political roots. How and when did the ELN get involved in the drug trade?
The ELN has been involved in the drug trade in the sense that Colombia is the biggest drug producer. It has been for many years. And in the areas that they have influence, there have long been drug crops. The ELN still does have a political facade. And there are still true believers in the ELN. And of course, the money they earn does not go for the personal enrichment of its leadership, but does tend to get plowed back into the organization and their, well, more than 6-decade insurgency here in Colombia.
They're not the only active armed group in Colombia, though. How is the drug trade fueling conflict between the different guerrillas?
The drug trade has long been the fuel that's fed Colombia's 60-year civil conflict. There have been a lot of major actors have left the stage, but the ELN is perhaps the last group that remains standing that dates all the way back to the 1960s. At the moment, they're in a series of battles between other illegal armed groups, many of which are also former guerrillas. They were with the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, the FARC, that demobilized in 2017. Many of their members went back into the drug trade and are still active. And then we've got another very big group called the Gaitanistas, the Clan del Golfo. We've got at least a 3 to 4-way war here in Colombia between illegal actors as they seek to control the record levels of cocaine that Colombia is producing today.
And what are the consequences for everyday Colombians who are caught in the crossfire?
It depends where you live. But if you're in the countryside where there are coca crops, or you're along one of the border regions or one of the departure points along the coast, you feel the conflict directly. High levels of displacement, murder rates, the killing of community leaders. But even here in Medellin, where I'm sat, you see it in a slightly different way. There's a lot of displacement into the cities. There's a huge distortion of the economy through the money laundering of the proceeds from the drug trade. But I think it's safe to say that almost every Colombian still directly feels in one way or another collateral damage or the pressure from the drug trade and the civil conflict.
Let's talk about the ELN's alleged international connections. You mentioned Venezuela, and the Maduro government is being accused of providing support for the ELN. What evidence is there for that?
I think it's important to note, to start with, that the ELN's Marxist-Leninist ideology is very much aligned with the Bolivarian revolution of Hugo Chavez and the Venezuelan administration of Nicolas Maduro. So they do see themselves as ideologically aligned. The ELN have presence in at least 8 of Venezuela's 24 states, particularly along the border. And they have, I would say, a symbiotic relationship with the Maduro regime. In the areas that they have influence in Venezuela, they suppress the opposition, any kind of opposition to the Maduro regime, and they are allied with elements in the Maduro government in the interests of drug trafficking, smuggling, and the gold trade. And so the ELN provide access to criminal rents for many of the senior figures in the Maduro regime.
The Trump administration has named the ELN as one of the groups targeted in its strikes on alleged drug trafficking boats. Is it credible, in your opinion, that the ELN is operating these boats?
No. The ELN's activity and involvement in the drug trade is restricted to the coca crops, laboratories, and some of the crossing points from Colombia into Venezuela. To date, we have no evidence of them owning drug shipments that leave on go-fast boats. They're simply not that active, that high in the drug chain. They are restricted almost exclusively to production and internal movement in Colombia and into Venezuela.
More broadly speaking, are these U.S. strikes on boats likely to disrupt drug trafficking from Colombia, which is, of course, the world's biggest cocaine producer?
No. What we've seen so far, and as you know, the strikes began on the Caribbean coast, and they've only just more recently moved to the Pacific. On the Caribbean coast, what we've seen, and our team in Venezuela have noted this, is that the drugs that were leaving the Caribbean coast, principally in the go-fast boats, are no longer doing so. And the drug routes through Venezuela have been pushed southwards. So the cocaine is still transiting Venezuela, but it's going south towards Guyana, Suriname, French Guiana, and Brazil. So far, the US actions have not interrupted production or the flow of cocaine, but they have affected the routes and the modus operandi through the Caribbean.
Colombia's president has until now shown defiance. Do you see U.S. pressure leading him in any way to change his approach to tackling the issue of drug production and trafficking in his country?
President Gustavo Petro was elected off the back of peace negotiations with the different actors and a new approach to the drug trade. And what he said he wanted to do was to not criminalize the coca farmers and therefore not put the principal emphasis on the eradication of drug crops, but rather concentrate on the higher links in the chain, the transporters, the owners of the shipments, the global networks. While laudable in its inception, this has not had much effect on cocaine production, which continues to increase. And there has been a lot of, I would call it, social media war between President Petro and President Trump, who both use social media as a way to explain and promote their policies. And this clash has had a significant effect on relations between Colombia and the United States. Colombia has traditionally been the United States' principal ally in the region, not just in terms of the drug trade, but geopolitically as well. There are elections next year in Colombia for a new presidency. So to answer your question, I don't think there's going to be a radical change from President Petro. He's on the way out. He's a defiant and obstinate politician, and he believes that some of the policies coming out of Washington are damaging, not just for Colombia, but for the region.
President Petro might be on his way out, but on his way in, he promised total peace to Colombians. And peace talks between the Colombian president and the ELN have failed repeatedly. Now, both sides have apparently proposed resuming negotiations. What issues would they need to resolve to end the violence? And is there even time under Gustavo Petro to get there?
I think you've hit the nail on the head with the last part of that question. Is there time? And the answer is absolutely not. One of the big stumbling points in the relationship between the Colombian government and the ELN was the ELN saying, listen, we're not just going to hand over our weapons. What we need to see before we get anywhere close to that point is some real changes to Colombia's political system, to the treatment of communities in the areas that they have presence, and in the fulfillment of promises made during previous peace processes, including that we've mentioned with the FARC. We've got less than a year now until Gustavo Petro hands over to another president. There is absolutely no chance that these underlying issues can be addressed in such a short time. The best we can hope for is that a dialogue is ongoing, and progress is being made gradually, and a new president decides to continue this whole negotiation.
This is Jeremy McDermott, the co-director of Inside Crime. Thanks so much for your time, Jeremy. That was great having you on the show.
My pleasure.